Before we begin, a mandatory disclaimer for our audience. The following story is a work of fiction for entertainment purposes. Although set within a real historical context, the characters and dialogues are fictional and do not represent factual or documentary accounts. Have you ever stood on a deck so vast it felt like the very foundation of a nation? Have you ever touched steel that didn't just carry the scars of battle, but the weight of a world finally finding its way back to peace? We spend a lot of time talking about the ghosts of the Atlantic and the titans that vanished beneath the Pacific waves, but there is one ship that refused to become a memory. They called her the Mighty Mo, the USS Missouri. She wasn't just another Iowa-class battleship. She was the culmination of everything we had learned about war, a fast, lethal, and beautiful machine that seemed to possess a soul of its own. To the enemy, she was a terrifying wall of fire that could outrun anything she couldn't outgun. To us, she was a sanctuary of American steel, a promise that no matter how dark the night got, we were going to be the ones standing when the smoke cleared. How does a ship go from the blood-soaked beaches of Iwo Jima to the calm waters of Tokyo Bay to witness the end of the greatest slaughter in human history? I was a gunner's mate on that deck, and I can still feel the vibration of those 16-inch guns in my teeth. A rhythmic reminder of the day we stopped fighting and started remembering. My name is just another entry in a dusty logbook, but in the early months of 1945, I was a young man looking out at a horizon that was constantly on fire. We were the latecomers to the party, the Missouri having been commissioned when the tide had already turned, but the Pacific was still a deadly, unforgiving place. The fascination we felt for our own ship was different from what the Germans or Japanese felt for theirs. We didn't view the Missouri as a god or a sacrificial lamb. We viewed her as a tool, the most advanced, most polished tool in the shed. She was built for speed, designed to keep up with the carriers and swat anything out of the sky that dared to approach. But she also carried the big sticks, 9 16-inch guns that could drop a payload the weight of a jeep onto a target 20 miles away with surgical precision. The first time I saw those turrets rotate, I felt a cold chill of pride. It wasn't just the power, it was the engineering. The Missouri was the peak of the battleship's evolution, a masterpiece of American industrial might that had arrived to put a definitive exclamation point at the end of a very long, very bloody sentence. I remember the smell of the Missouri more than anything else, a mix of fresh gray paint, salt air, and the ozone of the radar sets. There was a psychological weight to being on that ship, a sense of Mighty Mo destiny. We knew we were on something special. While the Bismarck and Yamato were ships of desperation, we were a ship of momentum. But don't let the confidence fool you. The Pacific in '45 was a gauntlet of suicide. The fascination with our armor was tested every day by the Kamikazes, the divine wind pilots who didn't care about our guns, only about finding a way to die against our hull. I remember standing at my 40mm mount, watching those planes dive through a curtain of tracers, realizing that even with all this steel, we were still just men on a piece of metal in the middle of a very big ocean. The Missouri was our home, our fortress, and eventually, she would become the world's most famous witness. By July 1945, the Missouri was no longer just a participant in the war, she was a herald of its conclusion. We were operating deep within the Japanese home waters, sometimes so close to the coast that we could see the green of the pines on the hillsides through our spotting glasses. The fascination of the previous months, the constant terror of the Kamikaze, had shifted into a heavy, expectant tension. We were the Mighty Mo, and we were leading the final charge, hurling our 16-inch shells into the industrial heart of Honshu. I remember the night bombardments of the steel mills at Muroran and the factories at Hitachi. The sky would light up with the orange glow of our muzzle flashes, a rhythmic artificial lightning that announced to the Japanese people that the end was not just coming, it was at their doorstep. There was a grim psychological weight to these missions. We knew the enemy was beaten, but like a cornered beast, they refused to lay down their arms. The atmosphere on board the Missouri during those final weeks was surreal. We were a city of 3,000 men living on the edge of an abyss. The fascination of our daily routine, the mail calls, the movies shown on the mess deck, the constant cleaning of the guns, was a thin veneer over a deep-seated anxiety. We were preparing for Operation Olympic, the invasion of the Japanese mainland. We were told to expect casualties on a scale that the world had never seen. I remember looking at the massive steel decks of the Missouri and wondering if they would soon be covered in the blood of 1,000,000 men. The ship felt invincible, yes, but we knew that even the thickest armor couldn't protect us from the sheer desperation of an entire nation defending its soil. We were the pinnacle of naval power, a floating fortress of democracy, but we were sailing toward a horizon that looked like a funeral pyre. Then, the world changed in a way that none of us, not even the highest-ranking officers on the bridge, could have predicted. Rumors began to ripple through the ship like a shockwave. Stories of a new weapon, a single bomb that could vaporize an entire city. On August 6th and again on the 9th, the news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached us. The fascination we felt was a mixture of awe and a cold, creeping horror. The secret flaw of our era, the idea that a massive battleship was the ultimate expression of power, was suddenly rendered obsolete by a flash of light in the sky. We were still the most powerful ship in the fleet, but in the shadow of the atomic age, we felt like ghosts from a bygone century. The 16-inch guns that had been the voice of American resolve for years were suddenly silent, replaced by a terrifying new language that we didn't yet know how to speak. On August 15th, the word finally came over the ship's intercom. Japan had agreed to an unconditional surrender. I remember the silence that followed the announcement. There was no cheering at first, just a long collective exhale from 3,000 sets of lungs. The weight of years of fear, of lost friends, and of the constant threat of death simply evaporated. We were anchored in Sagami Bay, the silhouette of Mount Fuji rising majestically in the distance, a silent witness to the end of the slaughter. The Missouri was chosen by President Truman himself, a son of the state of Missouri, to be the site of the formal surrender. The fascination of being a weapon of war was now replaced by the solemn duty of being a temple of peace. We began to scrub the decks, to polish the brass until it shone like gold, and to prepare the mighty Mo for her most important mission yet. We weren't just a battleship anymore. We were the stage upon which the modern world would be born. September the 2nd, 1945, began with a sky the color of slate and a mist that clung to the waters of Tokyo Bay like a lingering ghost of the war. On the deck of the Missouri, the atmosphere was so thick with history, you could almost reach out and touch it. I remember looking up at the towering masts and seeing the American flag, the same one that had flown over the Capitol in Washington on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, fluttering in the damp breeze. The fascination of the previous years, the thunder of the guns and the smell of cordite was gone. In its place was a heavy, sacred silence. We were no longer sailors on a warship. We were witnesses to the closing of a chapter that had cost the lives of over 60 million people. The mighty Mo had been scrubbed until she glistened, but beneath the polish we all knew every weld and rivet had been earned in blood. The psychological weight of that morning was unlike anything I had ever felt. Hundreds of ships from the Allied fleet surrounded us, a forest of steel masts stretching as far as the eye could see. But all eyes were fixed on the Missouri's veranda deck. I was standing near my 40mm mount, peering down at the small green baize-covered table where the fate of the world would be signed. When the Japanese delegation arrived, climbing the gangway in their top hats and formal morning coats, a strange electric tension rippled through the crew. These were the men we had spent years trying to destroy, the representatives of the empire that had launched the divine wind. The fascination was intense, not of hatred, but of a profound, jarring curiosity. They looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated against the backdrop of our massive 16-inch turrets. The contrast was the ultimate visual metaphor for the war, the ancient world of imperial conquest, surrendering to the industrial might of democracy. General Douglas MacArthur stepped to the microphone, his voice steady but carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very steel of the deck. I can still hear his words. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." The fascination of that moment was in its simplicity. There was no grand spectacle, no triumphalist shouting, just the scratching of pens on paper. When the Japanese representative signed the instrument of surrender, followed by the Allied powers, It felt as if a massive, crushing weight had been lifted from the shoulders of every man on that ship. The secret flaw of war, the belief that conflict is the only way for nations to speak, was being silenced by a simple signature. As the ceremony concluded, the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, and a massive drone began to grow in the distance. We looked up as over 400 B-29 superfortresses and 1,500 carrier planes swept over Tokyo Bay in a final, majestic show of force. The sky was literally darkened by the wings of American air power. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight, a reminder that while the Missouri had hosted the peace, it was the combined, relentless will of a nation that had secured it. I remember looking at my hands still stained with the grease of the gun mounts and realizing they wouldn't have to load another shell. The Missouri had fulfilled her destiny. She had been the sword, and now she was the shield, a floating cathedral where the world had finally found its voice again. The war didn't end with a bang for the Missouri. It ended with a profound, echoing quiet. As the Allied fleet eventually weighed anchor and steamed out of Tokyo Bay, I stood on the fantail and watched the coast of Japan fade into the mist. The fascination that had driven us for years, the obsession with armor thickness, muzzle velocity, and kamikaze defense seemed to evaporate, replaced by a strange, hollow relief. We had won, but the world we were returning to was not the same one we had left. The mighty Mo had done something no other battleship in history could claim. She hadn't just survived the conflict, she had become its definitive landmark. The secret flaw of the battleship era was that it was destined to end, but the Missouri found a way to transcend her own obsolescence. She became the bridge between an age of fire and an age of hope. Her story didn't end in 1945, and that's part of the fascination that draws thousands to her decks today. While the Bismarck and the Yamato lay in the lightless depths as rusted tombs, the Missouri lived on. She saw the frozen hills of Korea, providing that same thunder of liberty for a new generation of soldiers. She was modernized, equipped with missiles and computers, proving that old steel could still learn new tricks during the Gulf War. But no matter how many Tomahawk missiles she fired, she remained in her soul, the ship of the surrender. In 1992, the final chapter of her active life was written, and she was decommissioned for the last time. Now, she rests in the quiet, sacred waters of Pearl Harbor, her bow facing the sunken remains of the USS Arizona. It is a powerful, silent conversation between two sisters, one that represents the day the war began for America, and the other that represents the day it ended. I'm an old man now, and the sound of the 16-inch guns is a memory that fades a little more each year, like an old photograph left in the sun. But when I close my eyes, I don't see the fire of Iwo Jima or the terror of the Kamikaze. I see that green baize table on the deck. I see the pens moving. I see the faces of men who realized, for the first time in years, that they were going to live to see another sunrise. The fascination of the Missouri isn't in her 45,000 tons of armor. It's in the fact that she became a sanctuary for the better angels of our nature. She is a reminder that even the most terrifying weapons ever forged by human hands can be repurposed as altars of peace. The Missouri stands today as a sentinel, a living museum that breathes the salt air of Hawaii. She tells the story of an industrial giant that found its heart. To visit her is to walk through the corridors of time, to feel the heat of the Pacific and the cool relief of the surrender. History isn't just a collection of dates and names. It's the vibration under your feet, the smell of the sea, and the hard-earned wisdom of those who were there. The mighty Mo didn't just witness the end of an era. She ensured that the new era began with a promise of dignity and restraint. If this journey across the decks of the USS Missouri has moved you, or if you feel a deeper connection to the history of the mighty Mo and the men who served upon her, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep the legacy of these great ships alive for generations who never heard the roar of the guns. Comment below. What do you think is the most important legacy of the Missouri? Is it her power in battle or her role in the peace? Let's keep the dialogue of history going together. Thank you for watching, and as we say in the Navy, I wish you fair winds and following seas. The fascination with the Missouri today often centers on that bronze plaque on the deck, the spot where the war officially died. But before the peace, there was the fire. We weren't just a platform for signatures. We were a weapon of shore bombardment. I remember the silhouettes of Iwo Jima and Okinawa rising out of the mist, jagged, hellish landscapes where our brothers were dying in the volcanic ash. Our job was to provide the thunder of liberty, to rain down shells that turned the earth inside out so the Marines had a fighting chance. There's a specific kind of fascination in watching a battleship work. It's a mechanical symphony of hydraulics, hoists, and deafening roars. When those 16-inchers fired, the entire 45,000-ton ship would slide sideways in the water from the recoil. It felt like the earth was cracking open. We were the hammer of the Pacific, and as we moved closer to the Japanese home islands, we knew we were sailing toward a moment that would change everything. The secret flaw of the battleship era was its end, but the Missouri was determined to be the one that turned out the lights. The transition from the training grounds of the Atlantic to the jagged, volcanic reality of the Pacific was a wake-up call that no manual could prepare us for. By February 1945, the Missouri was no longer just a pristine example of American naval architecture. She was a hungry predator moving toward a black-sanded island called Iwo Jima. I remember standing on the deck as we approached the shore, the silhouette of Mount Suribachi looming through the morning haze like a jagged tooth. The fascination we felt for the ship's power was about to be put to its first real test. We weren't just sailors anymore. We were the providers of the heavy iron. When the order came to open fire, the world as I knew it ceased to exist. The 16-inch guns didn't just make a noise. They created a vacuum, a physical shockwave that slapped your chest and stole the breath from your lungs. From my station, I watched the massive projectiles, each one weighing 2,700 pounds, arc through the sky like distant lethal birds before slamming into the Japanese fortifications. It was a mechanical, terrifying beauty. The psychological weight of shore bombardment is something that stays with you. We were miles off the coast, safe behind our thick belt of Class A armor, but through the spotting glasses we could see the hell our brothers were walking into. The Missouri was a fast battleship, built to outpace the fastest carriers, but here she sat, a stationary volcano pouring fire into the caves and tunnels of Suribachi. There was a grim fascination in seeing the landscape literally change shape under our barrage. Hills were leveled, bunkers were vaporized, but the Japanese didn't break. They were dug in deep, and the realization began to sink in that even the mightiest guns in the world couldn't win a war alone. We were a part of a massive industrial machine, a cog in a gear that was grinding its way toward Tokyo, one island at a time. The men on board, nearly 3,000 of us, moved with a frantic, rehearsed precision, reloading the hoists and checking the sights while the ship groaned under the recoil of its own fury. Life inside the Missouri during those weeks was a study in controlled chaos and high-tensile nerves. Unlike the Yamato, which felt like a temple, or the Bismarck, which felt like a fortress of doom, the mighty Mo felt like a city that never slept. The fascination of the American public with our Iowa-class sisters was reflected in the way we lived. We had ice cream machines, a soda fountain, and even a laundry that worked 24 hours a day. It was a bizarre contrast to the slaughter happening just a few thousand yards away on the beach. You'd spend 4 hours in the blistering heat of a gun tub, ears ringing and skin covered in cordite dust, and then go below to a mess deck that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. It was the American way of war, industrial, efficient, and relentlessly domestic even in the face of death. But the comfort was a thin veil. We knew the divine wind was coming. The rumors of the Kamikaze were spreading through the fleet, a psychological shadow that no amount of ice cream could melt away. By the time we moved from Iwo Jima toward Okinawa, the Missouri had found its rhythm, but the tension had reached a fever pitch. We were no longer just observers of history. We were becoming the target. The fascination with our ship's speed was our best defense, but the Japanese were no longer interested in a fair fight. They were looking for a way to break the American spirit by turning their planes into human-guided missiles. I remember the night watches, staring out at the pitch-black Pacific, knowing that somewhere out there, a young pilot was preparing to die just to see our deck burn. The Missouri felt invincible, yes, but invincibility is a fragile thing when faced with a man who has nothing left to lose. We were the mighty Mo, the apex of naval technology. But as the first bogies appeared on our radar screens heading into the Okinawa campaign, we realized that the real test of American steel wasn't in how much we could destroy, but in how much we could endure. By April 1945, the waters around Okinawa had become a graveyard of burning ships and shattered spirits. The fascination we once had for the beauty of the Pacific was replaced by a constant, neck-straining vigilance. We weren't just fighting a navy anymore. We were fighting a cult of death. The Kamikaze, the divine wind, was a psychological weapon designed to bypass our armor and strike directly at our sanity. I remember the sky over the Missouri being constantly etched with the white streaks of 5-inch flak bursts and the chaotic, crisscrossing tracers of our 40mm Bofors. It was a mechanical nightmare, a symphony of anti-aircraft fire that never seemed to end. Standing at my mount, the heat from the barrels was so intense it felt like it was melting the air in front of my face. We weren't just sailors. We were the last line of defense for a 45,000-ton target that every pilot in Japan wanted to call his tomb. The moment it happened is burned into my memory with the clarity of a flashbulb. It was April 11th. The radar screens were cluttered with bogies, a swarm of Japanese Zeros and A-6M planes weaving through our screen of destroyers. Then out of the low clouds, a lone pilot emerged, his engine screaming at a pitch that sounded like a human wail. He was low, skimming the whitecaps, heading straight for the Missouri's starboard side. The fascination of watching a man fly toward his own certain destruction is a paralyzing thing. We poured everything we had into him, 20mm Oerlikons, 40mm Bofors, even the 5-inchers, but he kept coming. He wasn't dodging. He was a guided missile made of wood, wire, and desperate will. I saw the pilot's face for a split second, a mask of focused intensity, before he slammed into the hull just below the main deck. The impact didn't feel like a bomb. It felt like a massive, dull thud that vibrated through the entire keel of the ship. A plume of orange fire erupted and gasoline from the plane's tank showered the deck and the gun crews. But then, something miraculous happened. Something that defined the mighty Mo legacy. The plane's bomb didn't detonate. The fascist dream of a catastrophic explosion that would send the Missouri to the bottom was thwarted by a mechanical failure, or perhaps by the sheer resilience of American steel. The damage was superficial, a scorched dent in the hull that we would later call a battle scar. But the psychological weight was different. When the fire was out, the captain did something that still sparks fascination and debate today. He ordered a military burial for the Japanese pilot. We gathered on the deck, the same deck that would later host the surrender, and committed our enemy to the deep with honors. It was a moment of profound, jarring humanity in the middle of a slaughterhouse. That dent in the hull became a symbol for the crew. It was proof that the Missouri could take the best the enemy had and keep on steaming. But the fascination with our survival was tempered by the reality of the war. We saw other ships, carriers like the Franklin and the Bunker Hill, turned into floating infernos by the same tactics. We realized that the secret flaw of the battleship era, its vulnerability to air power, was being held at bay only by the sheer volume of our anti-aircraft fire and the luck of the gods. The Missouri was a fast battleship, a sleek, modern hunter, but even she felt like a relic in a sky filled with suicide planes. As we continued to pound the shores of Okinawa, the 16-inch guns providing a rhythmic bass to the frantic treble of the AA guns, we knew we were approaching the end of the line. The Pacific was running out of islands, and Japan was running out of planes. The stage was being set for something far greater than a battle. It was being set for a transformation of the world.